Hey guys, my name is Belanger. I'm with the Discovery Passage Aquarium, and today we're doing a virtual tide pooling here at the Willow Point Reef. And as you can see, it's a very nice day. There's lots of people around. We have tide poolers, we have just people going for walks. We've got people actually jumping in the water today just to explore all the habitats that are underneath the surface out here. So it's great to see everybody out, but also good to be talking to you guys here for the folks at home, which I would imagine would be most of you during a pandemic. So today we're going to be talking about the geography of Willow Point Reef. So what makes this place so special, and what brings all of this life to this one spot. And then we're going to go into how to tide pool correctly. So when you guys do get the chance to come out here, you're doing it in a way that is minimizing the harm to the animals and the environment. And then we're going to go actually out to the reef itself and look at some cool finds and see how the ocean's doing these days. So yeah, let's jump in to start talking about the geography. The Willow Point Reef, it's made out of a material called sandstone. And sandstone has a habit of actually having small holes bored into it that animals will actually make bigger over a course of several years. So if you look closely, there's actually an ochre star that has actually made a little bit of a refuge out of one of these holes. So it's a small miniature tide pool made out of some of these holes that have been bored. And so he's staying nice and safe from the sun. He's staying nice and cool in this little tide pool. So in another one of these holes that animals have bored into the side of the rock, there is something called a plumose sea anemone. Now this guy, he is sort of nestled himself inside of this little miniature tide pool, so he stays cool when the tide is out, but when the tide is in and the water's moving, he comes out like this and starts feeding on plankton that is floating past in the current. So here we are at the base of Willow Point, where we can really appreciate the geography and how the water flows through the area. So right now we're at low tide, so the water isn't moving particularly quickly, and you can see that because it's actually safe for divers to come in here and swim. And also it appears like some children. The water does actually get quite warm in the summer because the water is also quite shallow, so the sunlight heats it up before the tide comes back in for it to move back down the passage. But during high tide, all of this water flows through here at a much faster rate. And that brings lots of plankton, larval fish, maybe some bigger predators that like to just hang out in the area for a little bit. But as the tide goes out, the reef starts to trap all this water, and the water actually starts to slow down. So that gives small plankton and small fish a chance to settle out and find little nooks and crannies to hide in. And that attracts some animals that eat plankton, such as some small birds, juvenile salmon, and if you look at all this algae here, this is all the stuff that zooplankton and whatnot likes to hide in. And if you're actually swimming out there and you give this stuff a shake, it looks almost like dandruff coming off. There's so many small amphipods and zoea, which is a name for a larval crab. They just start swarming. So that's what all of these juvenile salmon are coming into the area to feed on. So just if we look in here right at the base of the reef, if we're lucky, we'll actually get the chance to see some juvenile salmon jumping. And it's likely there are lots of flies around in the area too, so they could be jumping for that. Fish also jump to escape their predators. Oh, there was one right in the center. So here's an example of some tide pooling etiquette that we see quite a bit on Willow Point, and it's actually one of the most damaging things that actually happens when people are out here flipping over rocks. So if you look at this rock specifically, you can see it's covered in all of these calcareous tube worms. There's some sea cucumbers growing on there, and all of these bryozoans. And these animals, they can't handle direct exposure to sunlight, because as soon as they dry out, they perish. So what happened is someone came along and they flipped over this rock, but they didn't quite put it back. So if you come and take a closer look, actually, you can see all of these animals that are underneath the rock. They're also baking in the sun. For instance, this orange sea cucumber, which has crawled under this rock for protection from the sun, is now directly exposed. And even just a couple of hours exposed to the sun, there are animals that will actually get sunburned. And it's quite common to see leather stars get sunburns. So what we're going to do is we are just going to put this rock back the way we found it. So you can see a rock that is correctly placed back in its environment. All of the algae is exposed to the sun, and any portions where you can see tube worms, especially on this site where there are lots of tube worms growing around on rocks, they're all underneath in the shade. So here's another example. So we are just going to gently, oh, there's a little, looks like a gunnel of some kind. It's hard to see because he's moving really fast, but we are just going to slowly tip this rock back just like that. And now everybody's safe from the sun. So just walking across the reef here, we found something that almost looks like garbage when we first pick it up. And this is actually an old one because it's starting to fall apart. But this is actually, they call this an egg collar. And this is how a moon snail actually lays its eggs. So what it does is it mashes up a bunch of sand with a bunch of snail slime, and then it injects its eggs in between the sand grains. And when it sits like this, it actually exposes all the eggs to oxygen when the water flows over top of it, instead of just laying them in the sand. So this actually helps them develop quite a bit faster. So when you see one of these washed up on the beach, it's not garbage. So when I know when I first started intertidal, like going to the intertidal zone, and I found these, I definitely thought it was some sort of garbage of some kind. So definitely when you see these, let them be, or just leave them where you found them, but certainly definitely okay to pick them up and feel those individual sand grains. What we call a giant spiny pink star. It's one of the largest stars we get out here on the coast, just shy of the maximum size you get for sunflower sea stars, which we don't get as often anymore. But we found this guy sort of washed up in a suspicious spot on the reef, and it doesn't look like he's moving that much. But so what we're going to do is we're just going to put him back in the water and hope that he makes it. So we'll just put him back under here. Found here, this might just look like a regular ochre star, but it's actually in the process of spawning. Now, spawning is in animals such as sea stars, it's the broadcast of their gametes. So these are it's either the eggs or the sperm of the sea star. So when the water comes in, what's going to happen is the water is going to mix all the eggs and the sperm of all the sea stars on the reef, and then they'll grow into larvae, float around in the ocean for a bit, and then they'll settle back down as the next generation of sea stars. Distracted by some other sea creatures on the other side of the reef while there was a giant Pacific octopus crawling around on top of the reef, and some people watched it crawl underneath this crevice here, and it's likely that it actually lives in like right under where I'm standing. And this octopus, from what we could tell based on the photographs that we actually saw of it, he was about this big, which is about the size of an adult. So it's, generally speaking, that's as big as an octopus you're going to see out here. Here's an interesting find that we have, and these guys, this thing might just look like it kind of looks like a football almost. It's called a gumboot chitin, and these guys are special because they are a type, they're related to snails and slugs. However, their shells are actually underneath their skin. So you can see those ridges. There's 8 ridges and there's 8 plates under all of these ridges. So if you flip the animal over, it starts to look a little bit more like, actually doesn't look like anything you've ever seen before, but up here is the mouth, and this is called the foot of the animal, and you can actually see the gills in between the foot, and then this out here is called the mantle. So the gills are in there, and that's what they use to breathe. So just like roly-polies, when these animals are scared, they roll up into a ball just like this. So when the currents are really moving or there's lots of waves, essentially these just get passed around the ocean like just like a football. very special find. This is something called a nudibranch, and nudibranchs are, you can think of them like sea snails that do not have shells. And what's special about them is that there are lots of different species on the BC coast, and some of them are very, very colorful. So for instance, this one with its bright orange and white colors, it's called the clown dorit, and it likes to eat something called bryozoans, which are kind of like really tiny, like coral-like structures almost. They aren't corals, but that's the closest thing I can compare them. We found two really cool species in the same spot. So the first one is this giant, what looks like a rock at first glance, and in a way it actually is a rock. This is called a giant rock scallop, and it's one of the largest scallops that we actually get out here on the coast. So it's actually interesting that we see one of these, because these usually, what they do is when they're really young, they actually fuse themselves to the rocks that they want to live on for the rest of their life, like a barnacle. But sometimes they get knocked off and then they go back into a free living stage until they can find another rock to fuse onto. So we'll put that guy back exactly where we found them, which is important to make sure that they don't get lost. And we also have another animal down here, which at first glance is not obvious what it is, because that's typical for a lot of animals you find at low tide. So this right here, this is called a mottled anemone. Again, it's a very large anemone comparative to anemones you find around the world. And so it looks like just a blob, and that's because all the tentacles are actually hidden inside of it at the time. So if you look at them here, you can actually see the tentacles just sticking out, but it's quite large. So just for scale, you can see it just barely fits in your hands like that. So this right here, this is something called a leafy hornmouth, and it's a type of sea snail. And if you look at it, it's got really thick shells, and that's because it likes to live in environments like this that are constantly being bashed by waves. But what's interesting about this creature is that it eats barnacles, and it actually has a little tooth that is built into its shell. So if you look at this thing here, I don't know if you can quite see that on the camera, but essentially what it does is it aligns that with the opening of a barnacle shell, and then it pulls itself down against the substrate with its foot, and it cracks open the barnacle shell, and then he gets his radula in there and he starts slurping up the tissues inside the barnacle to eat. So down here you can see this is something called a daisy brittle star. This is a calcareous tube worm. These are blue ringed top snails. And then, of course, here are your orange cup corals. We've made it out to the end of the reef, and what we found is something called an urchin barren. Now, an urchin barren is an area of a reef or a kelp forest that urchins have taken over the entire environment, where they've eaten all the kelp, they've occupied all of the habitats, and they basically reign supreme. So these species, these are called green urchins, and they've really anchored themselves into the rock for the high tide, so birds like seagulls can't actually grab them. And you can see, if we look over here, we can actually see one of the predators that actually are left for urchins, and this is a leather star. So leather stars are one of the last remaining predators of green urchins in the area. The others were the sunflower sea star, which there are still some around, and of course the sea otter, which was of course a very big predator that we unfortunately don't have anymore. All right, well, thanks guys for joining us on our virtual visit to the Willow Point Reef. Hopefully we get to see you guys around the aquarium soon when we get the chance to open. But until then, you can check out our online content through the Discovery Passage Aquarium video series on our social media channels and website. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.